The year is 1546, and the most powerful man in England can barely walk. King Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, now weighs over 300 pounds and suffers from festering leg ulcers that refuse to heal. The stench from his wounds is so overpowering that courtiers struggle to remain in his presence. "The King's Majesty grows daily worse," whispers Thomas Wriothesley to a fellow counselor, and his physicians dare not tell him the truth of his condition. Henry's transformation from Renaissance prince to dying tyrant represents one of history's most dramatic falls. In 1509, he had ascended the throne as an athletic, intellectual young man who could joust, compose music, and debate theology with the greatest minds of his age. Now, at 55, he requires mechanical devices to lift his massive frame onto his horse, and his courtiers live in terror of his increasingly unpredictable rages. The king's physical deterioration had been gradual but relentless. His famous jousting accident of 1536, when his horse fell on him during a tournament at Greenwich, marked the beginning of his decline. The injury to his leg never properly healed, developing into chronic ulcers that would plague him for the rest of his life. Court physician Thomas Wendy recorded in his private notes, "His Majesty's wounds discharge a humor most foul, and the corruption spreads despite all our ministration." By 1546, Henry's daily routine had become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to hide his infirmities from foreign ambassadors and potential enemies. Each morning, a team of servants would help dress his enormous frame, padding his clothes to create the illusion of kingly magnificence rather than obesity. The elaborate ritual of the morning levee, where nobles would attend the king's rising, had become a grotesque parody of royal power, with Henry struggling to maintain his composure as waves of pain shot through his diseased legs. The king's appetite had become legendary and horrifying in equal measure. Palace records show that Henry could consume vast quantities of meat, wine, and sweets in a single sitting, often vomiting between courses to make room for more food. His Majesty did feast upon a whole roasted peacock, 3 capons, and sundry pastries, recorded one shocked dinner companion, yet seemed unsatisfied and called for more wine. The chronic overeating exacerbated his existing health problems and added new ones, including what modern doctors would recognize as diabetes and heart disease. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the change in Henry's mental state. The paranoid suspicion that had always been part of his character now consumed him entirely. He saw enemies everywhere, convinced that his own courtiers were plotting against him. In 1546, he ordered the execution of the Earl of Surrey on charges of treason so flimsy that even his hardened counselors were shocked. "The king suspects every shadow," wrote the French ambassador, "and trusts no man, not even those who have served him faithfully for decades." The stench from Henry's ulcerated legs had become so severe that special arrangements had to be made wherever he went. Servants would burn sweet herbs and scatter rose petals before his arrival, but nothing could completely mask the smell of rotting flesh. Foreign diplomats complained privately about the ordeal of audiences with the English king, with one Venetian ambassador writing home, "To approach His Majesty's person requires great fortitude, as the corruption of his wounds assails the senses most grievously." Henry's physicians were trapped in an impossible situation. They knew their patient was dying, but to suggest this to the king was treason. Under English law, predicting the monarch's death was tantamount to wishing for it, a capital offense. So they continued their futile treatments, applying poultices of ground pearls and gold leaf to his wounds while privately preparing for the inevitable. John Chamber, one of Henry's longest-serving physicians, confided to his diary, "We are but players in a tragedy, knowing the ending but forbidden to speak it." The king's relationship with his final wife, Catherine Parr, had become strained to the breaking point. Once an intellectual companion who shared his love of theological debate, Catherine now found herself walking on eggshells around her increasingly volatile husband. In 1546, she nearly lost her head when Henry suspected her of heretical leanings, saved only by her quick thinking and abject submission. "I submit myself wholly to your Majesty's wisdom," she had pleaded, "as my only anchor, supreme head and governor here on earth, next under God." As 1546 turned to 1547, it became clear that Henry's body was finally giving up its long fight. The once powerful frame that had dominated every room now struggled to perform the most basic function. He could no longer walk without assistance, and even sitting upright for extended periods caused him visible distress. Yet still he clung to power, refusing to make adequate preparations for the succession or to acknowledge his mortality. The king's final weeks were marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to find a cure for his condition. Quack doctors appeared at court, promising miraculous treatments, only to be dismissed or sometimes executed when their remedies failed. One unfortunate physician suggested that the king's condition might be divine punishment for his many executions, a diagnosis that cost him his life within hours. "His Majesty will hear no word of mortality," observed Thomas Cranmer, as if speaking of death could hasten its approach. On January 27, 1547, Henry VIII finally succumbed to his ailments at Whitehall Palace. According to witnesses, his final hours were marked by delirium and terror, as if he could see the ghosts of all those he had sent to the scaffold. Thomas Cranmer, summoned to give the king his final rites, found Henry unable to speak but still capable of gripping his hand when asked to show faith in Christ's mercy. "I doubt not but his faith was sufficient," Cranmer would later write, though privately he wondered what judgment awaited such a blood-soaked soul. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed just how much his physical decay had accelerated in his final month. Court officials, accustomed to his massive size, were still shocked by the corpse they had to prepare for burial. The body had swollen grotesquely in death, requiring the construction of a specially enlarged coffin. Even more disturbing, according to several accounts, the corpse began to leak bodily fluids, forcing embalmers to work quickly in increasingly difficult conditions. The funeral arrangements became a logistical nightmare. Henry had planned an elaborate burial ceremony that would rival those of any European monarch, but his deteriorated remains made such pomp problematic. The coffin, reinforced with lead to contain the decomposing body, was so heavy that special equipment had to be constructed to move. "Never has a Christian burial required such engineering," complained the master of ceremonies, tasked with organizing the impossible spectacle. Perhaps the most infamous detail of Henry's death involves the alleged incident at Sion Abbey, where his coffin rested overnight during the journey to Windsor Castle for burial. According to contemporary accounts, the lead coffin cracked under pressure from the decomposing gases, causing bodily fluids to leak onto the chapel floor. By morning, witnesses reportedly found stray dogs licking at the spilled remains of their former king. Whether this story is entirely accurate remains debated by historians, but it perfectly captured contemporary feelings about Henry's ignominious end. The contrast between Henry's death and his life could not have been more stark. This was the man who had once been called the handsomest prince in Europe, who had written music that was performed in courts across the continent, who had debated theology with Erasmus and challenged the Pope himself. Yet he died alone, bloated, stinking, and feared by all who knew him. The Golden Prince had become a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power and the inevitable triumph of mortality over earthly glory. The impact of Henry's horrific final years extended far beyond his personal tragedy. His physical and mental decline had paralyzed the English government during a crucial period when the country faced threats from Scotland, France, and internal religious division. Important decisions were delayed or made capriciously, depending on the king's mood and physical condition on any given day. "The realm suffers when the king suffers," observed one perceptive courtier, "and we have suffered long." Foreign observers watched Henry's decline with a mixture of fascination and horror. The man who had once been the arbiter of European politics had become a figure of morbid curiosity. Diplomatic reports from the period read like medical bulletins, with ambassadors competing to provide their masters with the most detailed accounts of the English king's deterioration. "His Majesty's condition grows daily more pitiable," wrote the imperial ambassador, "yet none dare speak of it openly for fear of their lives." The religious implications of Henry's suffering were not lost on his contemporary. Many Catholics saw divine justice in the agonizing decline of the man who had broken with Rome and dissolved the monasteries. Protestant reformers, meanwhile, struggled to explain why God would allow such suffering to befall the man who had freed England from papal tyranny. "The ways of providence are mysterious," preached Hugh Latimer carefully, "and not for mortal men to judge." Henry's relationship with his children during his final years was complicated by his physical condition and mental state. His heir, young Edward, was largely kept away from his dying father, ostensibly to protect the boy's health, but also to shield him from the disturbing sight of royal mortality. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth were occasionally summoned to court, but these visits were brief and formal, more about maintaining appearances than genuine familial connection. The economic cost of Henry's final years was enormous. His medical expenses alone bankrupted several noble families, who were expected to contribute to the king's care. The constant need for new clothes to accommodate his expanding girth, special furniture to support his weight, and medical equipment to manage his condition drained the royal treasury. His Majesty's body requires the resources of a small army, complained Thomas Wriothesley, struggling to balance the royal accounts. Perhaps most tragic of all was the waste of Henry's remaining intellectual faculty. Even as his body failed, his mind retained much of its former sharpness, allowing him to fully comprehend his physical degradation and the fear he inspired in others. Court observers noted moments when the king seemed to realize the full horror of his situation, leading to fits of rage or despondency that terrorized everyone around him. "His Majesty knows what he has become," whispered one brave courtier, "and the knowledge torments him beyond all physical pain." The medical understanding of Henry's time was completely inadequate to address his complex health problems. His physicians, trained in medieval traditions of humoral medicine, applied treatments that likely worsened his condition. They bled him regularly to balance his humors, applied mercury compounds to his ulcers, and fed him elaborate concoctions designed more to please than to heal. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry suffered from diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney problems, and possibly testicular cancer, none of which could be effectively treated with 16th-century medicine. The psychological toll on Henry's courtiers was immense. Men who had served him for decades found themselves unable to bear his presence, making excuses to avoid audiences with their sovereign. The constant fear of triggering one of his rages, combined with the physical ordeal of being near his diseased body, created an atmosphere of barely controlled terror throughout the English court. "We serve not a king but a walking corpse," one anonymous courtier wrote in a letter that cost several men their lives when it was discovered. As news of Henry's condition spread throughout Europe, foreign powers began positioning themselves for the chaos that would follow his death. The Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, longtime enemies, found themselves in the strange position of hoping for Henry's survival, as his death would inevitably lead to civil war in England that could upset the balance of European power. "Better the devil we know," observed a French diplomat, "than the chaos of a child king and ambitious regents." The transformation in Henry's personality during his final years was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his decline. The man who had once charmed ambassadors with his wit and learning now subjected them to incoherent rants about imaginary enemies and past glories. His memory, once legendary for its precision, now played tricks on him, causing him to confuse current events with incidents from decades past. "His Majesty inhabits a world of his own creation," noted Thomas Cranmer sadly, watching his longtime master slip away. The practical challenges of governing with such an incapacitated monarch led to the rise of powerful court factions who competed to control access to the king. The Seymour brothers, led by Edward Seymour, later Duke of Somerset, maneuvered against the conservative faction led by Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Henry, in his weakened state, became a prize to be won rather than a ruler to be obeyed, though none dared openly acknowledge this reality. The impact on Henry's servants was profound and largely unrecorded by history. The men who had to physically care for the king's body bore the brunt of his condition daily. They dressed his wounds, changed his fouled clothing, and lifted his enormous frame, all while maintaining the fiction that they served the mighty King of England. Many requested transfers to other duties, leading to a constant turnover in the king's personal staff during his final months. Religious services in Henry's presence became ordeals for all involved. The king's condition made it difficult for him to remain still for the length of a full mass, and his occasional outbursts of pain or anger disrupted the solemn proceedings. Priests learned to abbreviate services when the king was present, though they could never acknowledge this accommodation openly. "Even God's worship must bow to His Majesty's infirmities," one chaplain observed privately. The question of Henry's mental competence during his final months raises troubling questions about the legitimacy of his last decisions. His final will, which determined the succession and distributed vast estates, was signed by a man who was clearly not in full possession of his faculty. Yet none dared challenge it during his lifetime, and its provisions would shape English history for generations. "We witnessed not the will of a king," one observer later wrote, "but the last gasps of a dying tyrant." Henry's final Christmas, celebrated at Greenwich Palace in December 1546, was a grotesque parody of royal magnificence. The king, propped up in his chair and struggling to stay conscious through the festivities, presided over elaborate banquets he could barely eat and entertainments he could no longer follow. Courtiers performed their traditional roles while privately wondering if they would live to see another Christmas with this particular monarch. The international implications of Henry's visible decline cannot be overstated. England's position as a major European power depended largely on the personal authority and charisma of its monarch. As Henry's condition became impossible to hide, England's enemies grew bolder and its allies more distant. The careful balance of European politics that Henry had maintained through decades of skillful diplomacy began to collapse as other powers sensed weakness in the English court. The efforts to maintain royal dignity in the face of Henry's physical decay created increasingly absurd situations. Elaborate ceremonies were designed to minimize the king's movement, with servants trained to support him without appearing to do so. Foreign ambassadors were briefed on the proper etiquette for audiences with an incapacitated monarch, though such briefings could never acknowledge the true reason for these precautions. Henry's final public appearance came at the opening of Parliament in November 1546. An event that horrified those who witnessed it. The king, carried into Westminster Hall on a specially constructed chair, struggled to remain upright during the ceremony. His speech, once famous for its eloquence and power, had become a painful wheeze interrupted by fits of coughing. "We beheld not a king but a ruin," wrote one member of Parliament, expressing what all felt but none dared say aloud. The medical expenses during Henry's final year were staggering even by royal standards. Special equipment had to be constructed to lift and move the king, and his physicians required rare and expensive ingredients for their increasingly desperate treatment. The royal household accounts show payments for everything from specially strengthened beds to exotic medicines imported from as far away as China, all in a futile attempt to restore their monarch's health. As January 1547 dawned, even the most optimistic observers could no longer deny that Henry's death was imminent. The king himself seemed to sense the approaching end, becoming increasingly reflective about his reign and his relationship with God. He summoned Thomas Cranmer repeatedly, not for political business but for spiritual comfort, perhaps finally confronting the reality of his mortality after years of denial. The final days brought a strange peace to the terrorized court. As Henry slipped in and out of consciousness, his rages subsided and something of his former personality occasionally emerged. Courtiers who had avoided him for months found themselves genuinely mourning the approaching loss of the man they had once served with genuine affection, before fear replaced loyalty as the dominant emotion at court. On his deathbed, Henry reportedly expressed regret for some of his actions, though accounts differ on exactly what he confessed. Some sources suggest he mourned the execution of Thomas More, his former friend and chancellor. Others claim he regretted his treatment of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. What seems certain is that his final hours were haunted by the ghosts of his many victims, as justice finally caught up with the tyrant king. The moment of death itself, when it finally came in the early hours of January 20. Yet even in death, the king's body continued to cause problems, as his remains began the process of decay that would culminate in the infamous scene at Sion Abbey. Thomas Cranmer, who arrived too late to give Henry his final rites while the king was conscious, reportedly wept over the body of his former master. Despite everything that had passed between them, despite the terror and the bloodshed, and the corruption, Cranmer mourned the passing of the golden prince he had once known, now reduced to a swollen corpse that bore little resemblance to the magnificent young king who had once dazzled Europe. The immediate cover-up of Henry's death, kept secret for 3 days while his counselors maneuvered for position in the new reign, was perhaps fitting for a monarch whose final years had been built on elaborate deceptions about his true condition. Even in death, Henry remained a prisoner of the lies that had sustained his failing authority, his corpse hidden away while men plotted over the future of his kingdom. The proclamation of his death, when it finally came, was met with a complex mixture of emotions throughout England and Europe. Relief at the end of his tyrannical reign competed with uncertainty about the future under his 9-year-old heir. Few mourned the man himself, but many worried about what would follow the passing of such a dominant figure from the European stage. Henry's funeral, despite all the elaborate preparations, could not disguise the reality of what he had become. The magnificent ceremonials, the heraldic displays, and the solemn processions could not restore dignity to a corpse that had already begun its grotesque. The gap between the pageantry and the reality became a metaphor for Henry's entire reign. Magnificent in appearance, corrupt at its core. The legendary incident of dogs licking Henry's leaked remains at Sion Abbey, whether literally true or metaphorically accurate, perfectly captured contemporary feelings about the king's fate. The man who had demanded absolute obedience from every living creature in his kingdom ended as food for stray animals, his earthly authority finally and completely extinguished. In death, Henry VIII became not the glorious monarch he had imagined himself to be, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the inevitable triumph of mortality. His horrific final days served as a reminder that even kings must answer to higher authorities: time, nature, and ultimately, divine justice. The Golden Prince had become a rotting corpse, and with that transformation, the most dramatic reign in English history finally came to its ignoble end. The legacy of Henry's final years extended far beyond his personal tragedy, shaping English attitudes toward monarchy for generations to come. Never again would English subjects regard their sovereign with the same mixture of awe and terror that Henry had inspired. His visible mortality had demystified the crown, preparing the ground for the constitutional limitations that would eventually constrain royal power. Thus ended the reign of Henry VIII, not with the glory he had always sought, but with the stench of decay and the ignominy of physical collapse. His final days remain one of history's most powerful reminders that earthly power, no matter how absolute it may seem, cannot ultimately triumph over the forces of time, justice, and human mortality. The king was dead, and with him died the illusion of royal invincibility that had sustained the medieval world for centuries. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed the true extent to which his declining health had paralyzed the English government. Important state papers had gone unsigned for weeks as the king slipped in and out of consciousness, leaving crucial diplomatic negotiations in limbo and military preparations incomplete. The realm has been without true governance for months, admitted Edward Seymour privately to his brother Thomas, though none dared acknowledge this reality while His Majesty lived. The transition to the reign of 9-year-old Edward VI exposed the institutional weaknesses that Henry's personal authority had hidden for years. The Privy Council, accustomed to following the whims of an autocratic monarch, found themselves unprepared for collective decision-making. Factions that had been held in check by fear of Henry's wrath now emerged into open conflict, beginning the power struggles that would dominate Edward's reign. Foreign ambassadors, long accustomed to dealing with Henry's unpredictable but formidable personality, now found themselves negotiating with regents and counselors whose authority was questionable and whose policies were uncertain. "We knew where we stood with the old king," observed the French ambassador, "even when we stood in mortal peril. Now we deal with shadows and pretenders to power." The financial crisis left by Henry's final years became apparent only after his death. The enormous expenses of his medical care, combined with his continued extravagant lifestyle despite his infirmities, had drained the royal treasury to dangerous levels. His successor inherited not only a kingdom, but also crushing debts that would constrain English foreign policy for years to come. His Majesty's body consumed gold as readily as it consumed food, lamented the royal treasurer, surveying the empty coffers. The psychological impact on those who had served Henry during his decline proved lasting and profound. Many courtiers suffered what we would now recognize as trauma, unable to forget the sight and smell of their decomposing sovereign. Some abandoned court life entirely, retiring to their estates to recover from years of living in terror. Others became obsessed with their own mortality, having witnessed too closely the reality of physical decay that awaits even the most powerful men. Dr. Thomas Wendy, Henry's longest-serving physician, reportedly suffered a complete nervous breakdown after the king's death. The years of being forced to pretend that his clearly dying patient might recover, combined with the constant fear of execution for medical failure, had destroyed his mental health. "I have seen hell," he told his confessor, "and it wears a crown." He never practiced medicine again, spending his remaining years in religious contemplation. The servants who had cared for Henry's physical needs during his final months faced a different kind of trauma. They had been sworn to secrecy about the king's condition, forbidden to speak of what they had witnessed even after his death. Many carried the burden of these terrible secrets for the rest of their lives, unable to share their experiences with anyone. Some turned to drink, others to religion, all searching for ways to forget what they had endured. Catherine Parr, Henry's surviving widow, found herself in an almost impossible position after her husband's death. Having narrowly escaped execution during Henry's final paranoid phase, she was now free, but also vulnerable. The new Protestant regime viewed her with suspicion due to her previous radical leanings, while Catholics saw her as a heretical usurper. "I am a ghost," she confided to her stepdaughter Elizabeth, haunting a world that has no place for Henry's widow. The broader English population received news of Henry's death with complex emotion. While few mourned the tyrant who had terrorized the nobility for decades, many worried about the stability of the realm under a child king. The vivid rumors about Henry's horrific final months, whispered in taverns and marketplaces, created a mixture of satisfaction at divine justice and fear about what such stories meant for royal authority itself. Religious interpretations of Henry's death varied dramatically depending on the observer's faith. Catholic writers both in England and abroad saw clear evidence of divine punishment for his break with Rome and dissolution of the monastery. Protestant theologians struggled to explain why God had allowed such suffering to befall the man who had liberated England from papal tyranny, often settling on mysterious references to divine will that tested human understanding. The impact on Henry's children was profound and lasting. Edward VI, despite being kept away from his dying father, was deeply affected by the stories he heard about Henry's final months. Contemporary accounts suggest the young king became obsessed with his own health, constantly worried that he might suffer a similar fate. This anxiety may have contributed to his own early death at age 15, as he neglected his duties in favor of hypochondriacal concerns about his physical condition. Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, received the news of her father's death with characteristic stoicism, but private letters suggest she saw divine justice in his suffering. Having endured years of persecution for her Catholic faith, she viewed Henry's painful end as confirmation that God punishes those who rebel against his church. This conviction would later influence her own brutal persecution of Protestants when she became queen. Princess Elizabeth, only 13 when her father died, was perhaps most profoundly affected by the manner of Henry's death. The image of absolute royal power brought low by physical decay would haunt her throughout her own reign. Her legendary vanity and obsession with maintaining a youthful appearance, her refusal to marry and submit to any man's authority, and her careful cultivation of an image of divine invincibility, all stemmed partly from her determination never to appear as weak and vulnerable as her father had in his final days. The European balance of power shifted dramatically with Henry's death and the chaos that followed. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, freed from the threat of English intervention, moved quickly to consolidate his position in Germany and Italy. The French king, Henry II, saw an opportunity to reclaim territories lost to English forces during the previous decade. Scotland, long terrorized by Henry's armies, began planning revenge against their weakened southern neighbor. The medical community throughout Europe studied reports of Henry's condition with morbid fascination. His case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess and the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge. Physicians began keeping more detailed records of their royal patients' conditions, partly from genuine scientific interest, but also from a desire to protect themselves from accusations of incompetence should their treatments fail. The servants at Whitehall Palace faced the enormous task of erasing all traces of Henry's final illness from the royal apartment. Furniture had to be burned due to contamination from his wounds. Tapestries and carpets were destroyed because they had absorbed odors that could not be eliminated, and entire rooms required extensive renovation before they could be occupied again. The physical infrastructure of royal power had been literally corrupted by the king's decaying body. Thomas Cranmer, despite his relief at Henry's death, found himself struggling with complex feelings of guilt and loss. He had genuinely cared for the young prince he had once known, even as that man had transformed into a monster. In his private prayers recorded in his personal diary, Cranmer begged God's forgiveness for his own role in enabling Henry's tyranny, while also mourning the waste of talents and opportunities that the king's corruption had represented. The destruction of documents related to Henry's medical condition became a priority for the new government. Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered the burning of all physicians' notes, servants' testimonies, and official records that might reveal the true extent of Henry's incapacity during his final months. The legitimacy of the new regime depended partly on maintaining the fiction that Henry had remained mentally competent until his death. Foreign medical experts who had been consulted about Henry's condition during his final months found themselves in danger as the new government sought to eliminate all witnesses to royal weakness. Several Italian physicians who had traveled to England to examine the king were quietly murdered on their return journeys, their knowledge deemed too dangerous to survive. The price of seeing behind the mask of royal power was often death itself. The economic impact of Henry's death extended far beyond the immediate fiscal crisis. Trade relationships that had been based on personal agreements with the king required renegotiation. Military commitments made during his final paranoid phase had to be reassessed, and diplomatic treaties signed by an arguably incompetent monarch faced legal challenges. The entire structure of English international relations had been built on Henry's personal authority, and his death left dangerous gaps in the kingdom's external relationship. The psychological trauma experienced by Henry's courtiers created a generation of English nobles who were deeply suspicious of royal authority. Having witnessed the reality behind the pageantry of kingship, many became advocates for limiting monarchical power through parliamentary oversight and legal constraint. The seeds of England's later constitutional monarchy were planted partly in the horror that Henry's courtiers felt watching their sovereign's physical and mental collapse. The legend of Henry's death grew more horrific with each retelling, as contemporary witnesses embellished their accounts for maximum dramatic impact. Stories of supernatural visitations during his final nights, of ghostly voices crying for vengeance, and of prophetic dreams warning of divine judgment, became part of the folklore surrounding his death. Whether true or not, these tales reflected the genuine terror that Henry had inspired, and the satisfaction many felt at his ultimate comeuppance. The practical challenges of governing England during Henry's final months had required an elaborate system of deception and misdirection that continued even after his death. Official proclamations were issued in the king's name weeks after he had become incapable of coherent communication. Important decisions were made by counselors and then attributed to royal command, and foreign ambassadors were told elaborate lies about the king's health and activity. The machinery of government had learned to function without genuine royal oversight, preparing the ground for the regency that would follow. The religious confusion that marked Henry's final years intensified after his death, as different factions claimed to represent his true intention. Conservatives argued that his reconciliation with traditional practices in his final months proved he had rejected radical Protestant reforms. Reformers insisted that his deathbed conversations with Thomas Cranmer demonstrated continued commitment to evangelical principles. The reality was that Henry's mental condition had made coherent religious policy impossible, leaving a theological vacuum that would take decades to fill. The international mockery that greeted news of Henry's horrific death damaged England's reputation throughout Europe for years to come. Satirical pamphlets circulated in Paris, Rome, and Vienna, describing the Bluebeard king whose body had rotted away as punishment for his crimes against wives, subjects, and church. These attacks on English prestige contributed to the kingdom's diplomatic isolation during Edward VI's minority, as European powers lost respect for a nation that had been ruled by such a degraded monarch. The servants who had maintained the fiction of Henry's continuing majesty during his decline found themselves without purpose or identity after his death. Many had spent years crafting elaborate performances designed to hide their master's infirmities, developing skills in deception and misdirection that were useless in the new reign. Some became professional dissemblers, selling their expertise to other nobles who needed help maintaining appearances, while others retreated into obscurity, unable to readjust to honest employment. The medical legacy of Henry's final years was profound but largely hidden. His physicians' detailed observations of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and chronic infections provided valuable clinical data, but this knowledge was suppressed for political reasons and lost to medical science for centuries. Modern historians studying Henry's symptoms have contributed to understanding of how these conditions would have progressed in an era without effective treatment. But the contemporary medical establishment learned nothing because the information was too dangerous to preserve or share. Thus, the death of Henry VIII marked not just the end of a reign but the conclusion of an entire era in English and European history. The age of absolute monarchy, when kings could claim divine authority and unlimited power, had been fatally undermined by the spectacle of royal mortality that Henry's final months provided. Future monarchs would need to find new sources of legitimacy and new ways to maintain authority, knowing that their subjects had witnessed the ultimate powerlessness of even the most tyrannical ruler when confronted with the universal fate of human flesh. The stench that had permeated Whitehall Palace during Henry's final months proved almost impossible to eliminate. Even months after his death, servants reported lingering odors in corridors where the king had passed during his last public appearance. "The very stones remember His Majesty's suffering," whispered one palace cleaner to another, crossing herself as she scrubbed floors that seemed permanently tainted by the memory of royal decay. Special mixtures of herbs and perfumes were burned continuously, but nothing could completely erase the olfactory reminder of mortality that clung to the seat of English power. The elaborate mechanical devices that had been constructed to move Henry's massive frame during his final months became grotesque monuments to royal incapacity. The specially reinforced chairs, the pulley systems designed to lift him onto his horse, and the modified furniture that had accommodated his diseased body were quietly dismantled and destroyed. "Let no trace remain of His Majesty's infirmities," ordered Thomas Wriothesley, understanding that these devices were evidence of weakness that could undermine royal authority for generations to come. The physicians who had attended Henry during his final illness found themselves in an impossible position after his death. Their detailed knowledge of the king's condition made them valuable witnesses to history, but also dangerous security risks to the new regime. Dr. George Owen, who had treated Henry's leg ulcers for over a decade, was found dead in his chambers 3 months after the king's passing, officially from natural causes but widely suspected to have been silenced permanently by agents of the crown. The international intelligence network that had kept European courts informed about Henry's declining health was systematically dismantled after his death. Spies who had risked their lives to report on the king's condition found themselves hunted by English agents, determined to eliminate all witnesses to royal weakness. "Dead men tell no tales" became the unofficial motto of those tasked with preserving the dignity of Henry's memory, even as they knew the truth of his horrific final months. The royal wardrobe masters faced an unprecedented challenge in disposing of Henry's clothing from his final years. The enormous garments, stained with bodily fluids and stretched beyond any normal human proportions, told the story of his physical decline more clearly than any written account. These clothes were burned in secret ceremonies, their destruction supervised by trusted servants who swore oaths never to speak of what they had witnessed. "His Majesty's raiment bore witness to his mortality," recorded one anonymous observer, "and therefore could not be suffered to survive him." The emotional trauma experienced by those who had served Henry during his decline manifested in various ways throughout the early years of Edward VI's reign. Some courtiers developed obsessive behaviors, constantly washing their hands as if trying to cleanse themselves of contamination from their diseased sovereign. Others suffered from recurring nightmares about rotting flesh and royal commands delivered in the voice of a dying man. The court physician Dr. John Chamber began drinking heavily and was often found muttering about the corruption that wears a crown. The question of Henry's final confession became a matter of intense speculation and political manipulation. Different factions claimed that the dying king had expressed regret for various aspects of his reign, depending on what served their current interests. Catholics insisted he had repented of his break with Rome, while Protestants claimed he had reaffirmed his religious reform. The truth was that Henry's final ravings had been largely incoherent, but this inconvenient fact was suppressed in favor of more politically useful interpretation. The servants who had been responsible for cleaning and dressing Henry's wounds during his final months were sworn to absolute secrecy about what they had witnessed. Many were relocated to distant parts of the kingdom and given new identities to prevent them from sharing their experience. "What we have seen must die with us," they were told by royal agents, understanding that the alternative to silence was likely to be a much more permanent form of quiet. Several of these servants suffered complete mental breakdowns within months of Henry's death. The diplomatic correspondence from Henry's final months required careful editing before being placed in official archive. Letters that revealed the true extent of his incapacity were destroyed or altered, while responses from foreign courts that referenced his obvious decline were suppressed entirely. "History must not record the full truth of His Majesty's condition," declared Edward Seymour, understanding that royal dignity required the systematic falsification of the historical record. The economic drain of Henry's medical expenses during his final year had been so severe that several noble families faced bankruptcy from their contributions to the king's care. The Duke of Norfolk, already under sentence of death, saw his estates further depleted by forced contributions to experimental treatments that everyone knew were futile. "We pour gold into a bottomless pit," complained one anonymous peer, buying hope where none exists, and prolonging agony that should be allowed its natural end. The psychological impact on Henry's food tasters, who had been forced to sample meals prepared for a man whose body was literally rotting from within, proved particularly severe. Several suffered from chronic nausea and developed phobias about eating that persisted long after the king's death. One taster, William Somers, never ate meat again after witnessing Henry's grotesque consumption habits during his final months, claiming that the sight of flesh reminded him too vividly of his master's decaying body. The musicians and entertainers who had been commanded to perform for Henry during his final months described the experience as surreal and nightmare. Trying to maintain festive spirits while their audience groaned in pain and occasionally lost consciousness created a bizarre atmosphere that haunted many performers for years afterward. "We played for a corpse that would not die," recalled one court musician, "and the music became a funeral dirge long before His Majesty breathed his last." The religious ceremonies conducted in Henry's presence during his final months had been abbreviated and modified to accommodate his condition, but these changes could never be officially acknowledged. Priests who had witnessed the king's inability to remain conscious during entire services were forbidden from discussing what they had observed. The sanctity of royal worship required the pretense that Henry had remained a devout and attentive Christian until his final breath, regardless of the reality his clergy had witnessed. The construction workers who had been employed to modify Whitehall Palace to accommodate Henry's declining mobility were systematically eliminated after his death. The men who had installed ramps, widened doorways, and reinforced floors to bear the king's enormous weight possessed dangerous knowledge about royal infirmity. Most were found dead within 6 months of Henry's passing, victims of apparent accidents or sudden illnesses that raised few questions in an age when life was precarious for the working classes. The international mockery of Henry's death reached such proportions that English ambassadors abroad found their effectiveness severely compromised. Foreign courts openly joked about the carrion king whose body had putrefied while he still lived, making serious diplomatic negotiations almost impossible. "How can we treat with dignity the representatives of such a degraded monarch?" asked the papal Secretary of State, expressing a sentiment that was widely shared throughout Catholic Europe. The medical equipment that had been used to treat Henry's conditions during his final months was quietly destroyed, but not before being studied by physicians hoping to learn from the failed treatments. The various devices for draining his ulcers, the mechanisms for supporting his enormous weight, and the apparatus for managing his bodily functions represented a grim catalogue of medical futility that offered few lessons beyond the ultimate powerlessness of human knowledge in the face of divine judgment. The servants responsible for disposing of Henry's bodily waste during his final months were perhaps the most traumatized of all his attendants. The king's incontinence, combined with the discharge from his infected wounds, created sanitation challenges that would have taxed modern medical facilities. These unfortunate individuals, bound by oaths of secrecy and terror of execution, carried psychological scars that manifested in various forms of mental illness throughout their remaining lives. The foreign physicians who had been consulted about Henry's condition during his final months became targets for elimination by English intelligence services. Girolamo Cardano, the famous Italian mathematician and physician who had examined the king in 1546, was poisoned while traveling through France 6 months after Henry's death. His detailed medical notes about the English monarch's condition disappeared with him, ensuring that professional medical opinion about Henry's final months would not survive to embarrass the new regime. The question of whether Henry's condition had affected his mental competence during his final months became a matter of intense legal and political debate. If the king had been mentally incapacitated, then his final will and testament, along with numerous other legal documents, could be challenged in court. To prevent this catastrophic possibility, all evidence of Henry's cognitive decline was systematically suppressed, and witnesses to his mental deterioration were either silenced permanently or relocated beyond the reach of potential legal inquiry. The elaborate deceptions that had been maintained about Henry's health during his final months created a template for royal propaganda that would influence English monarchy for centuries. The careful management of information, the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses, and the creation of alternative narratives to replace uncomfortable truths became standard practices for protecting royal dignity. Future monarchs would benefit from lessons learned during Henry's final crisis about the importance of controlling public perception of royal capability. The servants who had been responsible for carrying Henry during his final months, when walking became impossible for the enormous monarch, suffered severe physical injuries from their labor. The king's weight, combined with his unpredictable movements and occasional violent outbursts, created dangerous working conditions that resulted in broken bones, torn muscles, and permanent disabilities for many of his bearers. These men received small pensions in exchange for their silence, but their physical suffering continued long after their master's death. The diplomatic crisis caused by Henry's visible decline during his final months had far-reaching consequences for English foreign policy. The perception of weakness created by his obvious incapacity encouraged aggression from traditional enemies, while undermining confidence among traditional allies. Scotland began planning invasions, France prepared to reclaim lost territories, and the Holy Roman Empire positioned itself to exploit English vulnerability. The new regime inherited a kingdom whose international position had been fatally compromised by its monarch's public deterioration. The religious implications of Henry's horrific death continued to reverberate throughout Europe for years after the event. Catholic theologians used his fate as evidence that God punishes those who rebel against his church, while Protestant thinkers struggled to explain why divine providence had allowed such suffering to befall a reforming monarch. The theological debates sparked by Henry's death contributed to the broader religious conflicts that would dominate European politics for the remainder of the 16th century. The psychological trauma experienced by Henry's immediate family members during his final months had lasting effects on English royal behavior for generations. The sight of absolute power brought low by physical decay created deep-seated anxieties about mortality and vulnerability that influenced how future monarchs approached their roles. The obsession with health, the fear of showing weakness, and the elaborate measures taken to maintain royal dignity can all be traced partly to the horror that Henry's children felt watching their father's public disintegration. The servants responsible for maintaining the fiction that Henry remained capable of governing during his final months developed sophisticated techniques for deception that became part of court protocol. They learned to forge the king's signature with perfect accuracy, to mimic his voice well enough to fool distant observers, and to create the illusion of royal presence even when Henry was unconscious or incoherent. These skills in maintaining royal dignity through systematic deception would prove valuable to future regimes facing similar crises of legitimacy. The dogs that allegedly licked Henry's decomposing remains at Sion Abbey became the subject of intense superstition among the local population. Villagers claimed these animals were cursed, that they glowed in the dark, and that their howling could be heard for miles around the abbey. Whether the incident actually occurred or was merely symbolic, it captured the popular imagination as the perfect image of divine justice, the tyrant king reduced to carrion for scavenging beasts. Local authorities eventually had all the dogs in the area destroyed to prevent the spread of these disturbing rumors. The financial records of Henry's final year reveal expenses that seem almost impossible to believe. Beyond the enormous costs of experimental medical treatments, the crown paid for elaborate mechanisms to disguise the king's incapacity during public appearances. Specially trained actors were employed to double for Henry at a distance. Perfumers worked around the clock to mask the stench of his wounds, and seamstresses labored constantly to alter his garments as his body continued to swell and change shape even as he lay dying. The international intelligence reports about Henry's condition during his final months paint a picture of a monarch who had become a figure of morbid fascination throughout Europe. Foreign courts collected detailed accounts of his symptoms, his behavior, and his appearance with the same avidity that they might have shown for news of military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations. Henry, once the most feared ruler in Europe, had become its most pitied invalid, his decline tracked with scientific precision by enemies who no longer saw him as a threat. The elaborate system of mirrors and reflective surfaces that had been installed throughout Whitehall Palace to allow Henry to be carried from room to room without appearing to move under his own power became a source of terror for palace inhabitants after his death. Servants reported seeing ghostly reflections of the enormous diseased king in these mirrors long after his passing, leading to the systematic removal and destruction of all the optical equipment that had been used to maintain the illusion of his continuing mobility and dignity. The physicians who had attended Henry during his final illness were required to submit detailed reports about their treatments and observations, but these documents were immediately classified as state secrets and locked away in royal archives. Thomas Alsop, who had pioneered new techniques for treating Henry's leg ulcers, found his research notes confiscated and his medical innovations suppressed. Knowledge of the king's mortality, he was told, is more dangerous than gunpowder or poison, and must be contained with equal care. The courtiers who had been forced to endure Henry's presence during his final months developed elaborate coping mechanisms to survive the ordeal. Some began taking small amounts of poison to dull their sense of smell. Others practiced meditation techniques to divorce their minds from the physical reality of their situation, and a few simply fainted whenever they were required to approach the king closely. These survival strategies became part of court culture, passed down to new arrivals through whispered conversations and careful observation. The religious crisis precipitated by Henry's horrific death extended far beyond England's borders, influencing theological debates throughout Protestant Europe. German reformers struggled to explain how God could allow such suffering to befall a monarch who had broken with Rome, while Swiss Calvinists saw divine predestination in the king's agonizing decline. The spectacle of royal mortality challenged fundamental assumptions about divine right and earthly authority that had underpinned European political theory for centuries. The servants responsible for Henry's personal hygiene during his final months developed their own form of post-traumatic stress, manifesting in obsessive washing behaviors and phobias about physical contact that persisted for years after his death. Mary Woodhouse, who had served as one of the king's body servants, was found scrubbing her hands raw every night for 3 years after Henry's passing, muttering about stains that no one else could see but that remained vivid in her traumatized memory. The diplomatic dispatches from foreign ambassadors during Henry's final months reveal a gradual shift from respect to horror to barely concealed disgust as they witnessed the English monarch's decline. The Venetian ambassador's reports progress from formal diplomatic language to increasingly personal and emotional responses to what he was witnessing. "I cannot adequately convey to your serenity the full horror of His Majesty's condition," he wrote in his final dispatch, as words fail to capture what the senses struggle to endure. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as Henry's condition deteriorated, but the king's violent refusal to acknowledge his mortality made planning impossible. Courtiers who attempted to raise the subject of future arrangements were accused of treason and threatened with execution. This dangerous situation left England vulnerable to civil war, as no clear plans existed for the transition of power from an incapacitated monarch to his minor heir. The realm drifted toward crisis with each passing day of Henry's agonizing decline. The medical expenses incurred during Henry's final year included payments to charlatan healers and miracle workers who promised impossible cure. Desperate to find relief for their master, royal physicians consulted with astrologers, alchemists, and religious mystics who claimed supernatural powers of healing. One particularly expensive consultation involved importing a supposed saint's relic from Italy, which was applied to Henry's wounds with predictably futile results. The king's desperation made him prey to every medical quack and religious fraud in Europe. The servants who were tasked with disposing of the bandages and dressings from Henry's infected wounds faced a unique form of horror in their daily duties. These materials, saturated with pus and infected tissue, had to be burned in special furnaces to prevent contamination, but the process filled entire sections of the palace with the acrid smoke of burning flesh and corruption. Several servants assigned to this duty suffered complete mental breakdowns, unable to cope with the daily reminder of their sovereign's decay. The international ramifications of Henry's visible decline extended to England's colonial ambitions and overseas trade relationships. Foreign merchants became reluctant to enter into long-term agreements with a kingdom whose monarch was obviously dying, while colonial administrators struggled to maintain authority when news of the king's condition reached distant territory. The British Empire's future expansion was delayed by decades due partly to the loss of prestige caused by Henry's public deterioration. The elaborate fiction that Henry remained an active and competent ruler required the cooperation of hundreds of people, from high-ranking nobles to palace scullery maids. This conspiracy of silence was maintained through a combination of genuine loyalty, desperate fear, and systematic bribery. The cost of maintaining these deceptions added another enormous expense to an already bankrupted royal treasury, as keeping so many people quiet required constant payments and careful management of potentially dangerous information. The foreign physicians who were secretly consulted about Henry's condition during his final months provided diagnoses that were systematically suppressed by English authorities. Andreas Vesalius, the famous anatomist, was reportedly offered an enormous sum to examine the king but declined, understanding that such knowledge would make him a marked man. The few foreign medical experts who did provide consultations were sworn to secrecy under threat of death, and several mysteriously disappeared shortly after completing their examination. The psychological impact on Henry's confessor, Father John Longland, was particularly severe as he struggled to provide spiritual comfort to a man whose sins seemed to demand divine punishment. Longland's private writings reveal a priest torn between his duty to offer hope and forgiveness, and his growing conviction that Henry's suffering represented God's justice in action. "I minister to a soul already judged," he wrote in his secret diary, "and find no words of comfort that ring true in the face of such obvious divine wrath." The servants responsible for preparing Henry's food during his final months faced the challenge of creating meals that their master could consume despite his deteriorating condition. The king's appetite remained enormous even as his ability to digest food properly diminished, leading to scenes of grotesque consumption followed by violent illness. Kitchen staff were sworn to secrecy about these episodes, but many suffered lasting trauma from witnessing their sovereign's degrading relationship with food and his own failing body. The diplomatic crisis caused by Henry's condition reached such proportions that several European powers began making contingency plans for English civil war following his death. Military advisors in France and the Holy Roman Empire drew up invasion scenarios, assuming that Henry's death would plunge England into chaos, while Scottish leaders prepared to reclaim territories lost during the rough wooing of the previous decade. The king's visible weakness had made his kingdom a target for opportunistic neighbors. The elaborate ceremonies that continued to be performed around Henry during his final months became increasingly surreal as participants struggled to maintain dignity while their monarch groaned, bled, and occasionally lost consciousness before them. Court musicians learned to improvise extended instrumental pieces to cover gaps when Henry was unable to participate in religious services, while heralds developed techniques for conducting formal presentations even when the king was clearly not following the proceeding. The servants who had been responsible for Henry's mobility during his final months, carrying him between rooms and helping him maintain the appearance of walking independently, suffered severe physical injuries from their labor. The king's enormous weight combined with his unpredictable movements and violent outbursts when in pain made their job extremely dangerous. Several suffered permanent disabilities, while others died from injuries sustained while supporting their dying sovereign, becoming forgotten casualties of royal pride in the desperate attempt to maintain appearance. The question of Henry's mental competence during his final legal decisions became a source of secret debate among legal scholars for generations after his death. If the king had been mentally incapacitated when he signed his will or made crucial appointments, then the legitimacy of the Edwardian succession could be challenged in court. To prevent such challenges, all evidence of Henry's cognitive decline was systematically destroyed, and potential witnesses were eliminated or relocated beyond the reach of legal inquiry. The international medical community's fascination with Henry's case led to the development of new theories about the relationship between political power and physical health. Physicians throughout Europe began keeping more detailed records of their royal patients' conditions, partly from scientific curiosity but also from a growing understanding that medical knowledge could be politically dangerous. The study of Henry's symptoms contributed to advances in understanding diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and chronic infection, though this knowledge had to be pursued in secret. The servants who had maintained Henry's wardrobe during his final months faced the impossible task of creating clothing that could accommodate his constantly changing body shape, while maintaining the illusion of royal magnificence. Seamstresses worked around the clock to alter garments as the king's body swelled with fluid retention and infection, while specialized undergarments were designed to contain the discharge from his wound. These intimate details of royal dress became state secrets, known only to a handful of trusted individuals who were sworn to eternal silence. The religious ceremonies conducted in Henry's presence during his final months required careful choreography to accommodate his physical limitations, while maintaining the appearance of royal participation. Priests learned to abbreviate services when the king showed signs of distress, while altar boys were trained to position themselves strategically to block the view of Henry's more disturbing symptoms from other worshippers. The sacred rituals of Christian worship were subtly altered to serve the practical needs of a dying tyrant's vanity. The foreign intelligence networks that had kept European courts informed about Henry's condition during his final months were systematically dismantled after his death, with English agents hunting down and eliminating spies who possessed dangerous knowledge about royal weakness. The intelligence war over Henry's medical condition became almost as important as traditional military conflicts, as different powers sought to exploit or suppress information about English vulnerability. Several minor diplomatic crises erupted over accusations of medical espionage. The elaborate system of signals and codes that had been developed to communicate Henry's true condition to his inner circle became a template for royal crisis management that influenced European court protocol for centuries. Servants learned subtle ways to indicate whether the king was lucid, violent, or unconscious, without alerting foreign observers to his incapacity. These communication methods allowed the continuing function of government, even when the nominal head of state was completely incapacitated, establishing precedents that would prove valuable during future royal health crises. The physicians who had treated Henry during his final illness faced an impossible ethical dilemma between their medical oath to preserve life and their growing conviction that their patient's continued existence was causing enormous suffering to himself and his kingdom. Some secretly hoped for Henry's death as a merciful release, while others felt compelled to continue futile treatments out of professional duty. This moral crisis led several to abandon medicine entirely, unable to reconcile their healing mission with the reality of what they had witnessed in the royal sick room. The international mockery that followed news of Henry's death reached such extremes that English diplomats abroad requested reassignment rather than face continued humiliation in foreign court. The image of the once mighty English king reduced to food for dogs became a powerful symbol of divine justice throughout Catholic Europe, undermining English prestige for decades to come. The diplomatic damage caused by the manner of Henry's death proved almost as significant as the political instability that followed his passing, weakening England's position in European affairs just when strong leadership was most needed.